Right now, one of the big pieces of legislation that we are keeping our eye on is the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, if you haven't been keeping up with my content or other people's on this, pretty much it seemed like all of Joe Biden's hopes of passing another piece of legislation that is major and that would do a number of different things was completely hopeless. We had gone through months of either Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema, or both obstructing the process of getting anything passed and making us all quite angry, but it kind of conditioned us to believe that there wasn't really hope on getting something major passed through Congress. But then out of the blue, seemingly, Joe Manchin comes out and says, this piece of legislation I would support. It's called the Inflation Reduction Act. We will look into, after looking at a clip here of someone who's opposed to it, Senator Kennedy, what it specifically does and kind of, or I should say what it generally does. We're not going to look at the specifics. We did that in a previous segment. And overall, it's a really good piece of legislation. So it was kind of a shocker that Joe Manchin came out in support of it all of a sudden. Later in the show, we will be discussing Kyrsten Sinema, who's the last person that has to get on board for this to be passed. And it looks like her demand is quite reasonable and doable. So it could get passed, which is really exciting because, like I said, it's a good piece of legislation. And good news like that comes where it seems in American politics right now. But as I mentioned, the reason for this clip is to look at someone who's opposed to it. And that person is Senator John Kennedy, who of course is a Republican. And he made the claim that passing this piece of legislation would cause more people to be living in tents behind Whataburgers. Let's hear what he has to say.
Say it again. Joe's bill is an inflation machine. Now, I mean it. I don't hate anybody, John. I don't think Senator Manchin intentionally wants to hurt people. I don't think that he wants more Americans to have to live in a tent behind Whataburger. But that is going to be the result of his bill. I mean, just any economist who is fair-minded will look at this bill and tell you that.
So he had to put the fair-minded thing in there because plenty of economists and plenty of experts have looked at this piece of legislation and said, yeah, it could actually do what it's purporting to do and what they hope that it will do. So no, I don't think the Inflation Reduction Act will cause more people to be living in tents behind a Whataburger, contrary to popular belief, I guess. No. Instead, I think it'll do what they're hoping it will, which is decrease inflation and address climate change and invest in energy. Of course, some of that is kind of what you would call old energy or oil and gas, non-green energy, because Joe Manchin's supporting it. He's a big oil guy. So we're not getting everything we'd ever hoped. But I think you have to be realistic and understand there's going to be a transitionary period. And if that requires us still using, a good bit of oil and gas, that's fine as long as we're headed in the correct direction and making big cuts. So this piece of legislation would make a down payment on deficit reduction to fight inflation, which is awesome. Invest in domestic energy production and manufacturing. Again, something that Republicans say they would be on board with. Reduce carbon emissions by around 40% by 2030. Allow Medicare to negotiate for lower prices for prescription drugs. Expand the Affordable Care Act program through 2025. So if you are somebody who has watched this entire arc and this entire battle between primarily progressives and Biden and then Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, you understand things like trying to lower carbon emissions and negotiating, giving Medicare the ability to negotiate lower drug prices is things that were proposed in the larger Build Back Better bill that Joe Biden had proposed. And so if you want to give credit to Joe Biden on this, maybe those things wouldn't now be making it into the much compromised but still significant piece of legislation that is now looking realistic to pass if he hadn't originally proposed it in Build Back Better and continue to push on that. So I think there's plenty of critiques of Joe Biden. I think I had almost given up on his ability to get anything major like this passed, but you got to give some credit. I don't think giving Medicare the ability to negotiate drug prices, which is a no-brainer. It saves you money. It saves the government money. Why not negotiate drug prices with drug companies? We shouldn't just accept the prices they give us. We're a major buyer. We have that power, and we should negotiate and get lower prices for Americans and for the government, like I said. And so that was something that was in many of the proposed pieces of legislation that they were trying to push for, the Biden administration, that is, and progressives. And so now that's ending up in the smaller package that is now looking like it can get passed. So that's really good news. And fine, let the Republicans try to characterize that as something that it's not, as long as people like Joe Manchin, Joe Biden, and every single person who's in the Democratic Party goes out and makes a more effective message for why it is a good piece of legislation. And I really do believe it is. So I believe they're operating from the position of truth and facts. And as I mentioned, tons of the analysis I've seen from experts, economists, etc., says this is really good. And even though when I originally saw the number of 40% reduction of carbon emissions, I thought that was an overestimate, but it looks like that is what this bill would be expected to do if it became law. So that's really exciting. In the same piece of legislation, we can address inflation, which is on the minds of Americans right now. We can invest in American energy to, even to give something to the Republicans who say they care so much about us being energy independent, and we can lower carbon emissions. Why wouldn't everyone be on board with that? Well, we know why, but still a really good move in the correct direction, and I'm excited about it. And I don't think that Kennedy's prediction that this will cause more people to be living in tents behind the Whataburger is factual.